Hi, Misha here, and now that we have covered Lockheed Martin's earlier stealth aircraft, the F-117 Nighthawk and the F-22 Raptor, it's time to get to the F-35 Lightning, originally known as the JFS. This was meant to be a multi-service aircraft used by the Air Force, Navy, and Marines, as well as sold to various allies. So unlike the F-22, from the beginning this was going to be an export. To that end, the program has three major variants, which we'll talk about. This is the F-35A, kind of the baseline model. This is designed for standard takeoff and landing from airfields. It's basically the basic Air Force model, be it US or other. Next up, there's the F-35B, which was designed for short takeoff and landings, or even vertical takeoff or landings. Primarily developed for the US Marines as well as the British. And then the final member of the family is the F-35C, which was developed primarily for the US Navy and has seen some use by the US Marines as well. This is designed to operate from aircraft carriers, meaning the US is probably going to be just about the only taker, with its big difference being larger wings that can fold, as well as a reinforced tailhook system and landing gear for operating off carrier decks. To date, over 430 F-35s have been produced. However, it's been a very long road, dating all the way back to 1992, with many delays and overruns and all kinds of fun issues. The plane is a 5th generation fighter like the F-22. It is designed to be stealthy, but also have affordable, more durable stealth. And it's designed to address one of the F-22's shortcomings, that of not being easily upgradable and modifiable. And the US says that essentially it's wanting to go to a all F-35 fleet, replacing most other fighter aircraft in service. So with that, we'll get into it. Much like the F-35 itself, this video is behind schedule. That's what I get for trying to record on a Monday, though. I'm not going to go way deep into this because, to be fair, the story is still unfolding, and this is a pretty controversial aircraft. Frankly, rightly so. The JSF program, Joint Strike Fighter, dates back to 1992. So, right when the F-22 was getting into its advanced stages. The F-22 was supposed to replace the F-15, while the Joint Strike Fighter was meant to go into service with all the branches, as well as allies, and replace a whole wide range of aircraft, from the F-14 Tomcat to the legacy F-18 Hornet to Harriers, both in the US and the UK, F-16s. And that's really kind of, I think, what they were going for, was the second F-16. Several companies submitted designs, but really it came down to two. In 1995, Lockheed Martin, which was not a surprise, and Boeing, which was a surprise. Boeing had not really worked on fighter aircraft in decades. In fact, World War II was about the last time Boeing's aircrafts, the P-26P shooter. But one company that got left out was McDonnell Douglas, maker of the F-18. To that end, in 1997, as I said in my Hornet video, Boeing acquired McDonnell Douglas, which gave them kind of that naval edge. So from pretty early on, the X-35 was a little favored by the Air Force, whereas the X-32 from Boeing was kind of favored by the Navy and the Marines. More so the Navy. But in the late 90s, a lot happened. I'm not going to go into it here. One would take a lead and then have a setback. Another would take a lead and then have a setback. Boeing, for example, changed their wing geometry and overall plan a couple of times. Lockheed, on the other hand, had some financing accountability issues. It's worth pointing out that when it came time for the vertical takeoff and landing example, Lockheed would use a very interesting fan system with the shaft, kind of a gearbox fan system with the main engine, whereas Boeing would go with a direct lift system. And honestly, this is kind of what ended up giving the Lockheed an advantage. In 2000, in October, well, I should say, first they rolled it out, they showed it off, and then they test flew the X-35 for the first time in 2000. And really what kind of won them over was it was ready to go with the vertical landing situation. The full version could do that. Boeing, on the other hand, had to make some sacrifices to get their prototype to vertically land, and they promised they would fix it in, pre-production, but this seemed to scare people, and so they ended up going with the Lockheed. It was selected, and this was a huge deal because this was a major contract. The U.S. said it was planning to buy over 2,600, and several allies were going to buy as well. Britain was a major partner. In fact, B Systems, BEA, was instrumental in developing the whole thing to replace the Harrier and the RAF and the Royal Navy. Canada, Australia, Italy, Norway, Turkey, on and on. Many countries were involved or at least interested in buying. It was basically the largest single contract, and it was a winner-take-all contract at that. So when Lockheed got it, it was a big boon. And of course it wasn't just Lockheed alone. Several other companies were joined with them. One of the other early points of argument between the Navy and the Air Force was over the engine. The F-16 was never much liked by the Navy because they didn't like it that it had a single engine. The Navy really liked having two engines, considering it operated over the ocean. So, the Tomcat, the Hornet. The compromise was essentially they would go one engine, but it would be a very powerful, very tested, very redundant engine. So it was kind of an overkill engine to make them happy. Well, between 2000 and 2006, Lockheed would refine the design. They would first roll this out in February of that year. Then they would begin taxi testing in September. And then on December 15th of 2006, the first pre-production F-35A would take to the skies for a flight. And not to get too deep into it, this is what we have. This is a 5th generation fighter. It is designed from the outset to be multi-role. The Air Force primarily wanted to use it for close air support ground attack, but it was also designed for air superiority and other type missions. It used stealth technology, but unlike, well, I shouldn't say unlike, but they decided one upgrade they wanted to do with its stealth was make it more stable, more dependable, less resource intensive to maintain. So it ended up being not quite as stealthy as the Raptor, but also easier to keep stealthy. It ended up having the most powerful engine to date on a single engine on a fighter. It's just over 50 feet long, so relatively short for a modern plane. Has a wingspan, the 35A does, of 35 feet. Maximum speed is Mach 1.6. Max altitude is over 50,000 feet. It has a total of 10 hard points. 4 are located in 2 internal bays, much like the F-22, so they can be maintained for stealth. They can carry air-to-air missiles or 2 up to 2,000-pound air-to-surface bombs or guided missiles. Additionally, it can carry ordnance on the wings. It has a total of 6 hard points, 3 under each wing, for a total of 15,000 pounds. And it has a 25mm cannon, so a little bigger cannon, with 185 rounds. That's internal. It has a radar that still allows it to maintain stealth. It also has an integrated optical sensor. Essentially, it has an integrated, updated version of a lightning pod. It also has sensors to give it 360 degrees of a field of view to detect enemy aircraft or missile sites or what have you. Has a very spiffy advanced cockpit. It does not have a HUD. Rather, it has a fancy pants helmet that costs nearly $500,000 each. Because, yeah, how do you like that? The helmet for this is more than most people's houses. It has full-color touchscreen displays. It also has voice recognition software in the cockpit. One of the first fighter aircraft to do so. Ejection seat. It uses the same oxygen generation system as the F-22 and a few other components from the F-22. Again, it was designed to fill a myriad of roles. It was also designed to be easily upgradable. One of the failings of the F-22 is that it was not. This was designed to have easy software updates or hardware updates. Also designed for easy and relatively inexpensive maintenance. All the components, all the modules that it had were considered what they called one deep, meaning you only had to remove at most one component to get to them. And very early on, a refurbishment system, a depot system to carry parts. In theory, they should carry parts for all 3 versions, would be maintained around the world so that any F-35 from any Air Force could be refurbished and repaired there. And early on, a great deal of time and emphasis was placed on training these crews to repair them, including keeping the stealth technology up to date. So kind of learning from lessons with the F-22, frankly. So what's the problem? Why all the fuss? Well, initially, the whole idea behind the F-35, the whole reason the JSF program began, was people were worried in the government and in the military about the out-of-control spiraling costs of planes. And so this was seen kind of as a modern F-16, something that could be done on an economical basis and a one-size-fits-all. Now, they knew that they would have to have separate versions, A, B, C, but they thought they could use kind of the same building blocks, same basic engine, cockpit, just changing what needed to be changed for each version, so there's a lot of common parts. The idea was a good one. It was supposed to be a way to save money long term. Originally, Lockheed projected that these would cost 20% less per flight hour than F-16s. But what's happened is most everything that was originally promised about these F-35 was never hit. It's been said that now Lockheed's saying it's going to be 10 or 12% more per flight hour than the F-16. Although in most recent reports now they're saying that production has started, this should drop down again. The whole program was just behind schedule. By the summer of 2009, after the test flights, they had really hit all their major project goals, but the problem is they were already 2.5 years behind schedule. And of course, they were also super over budget. The first F-35A was delivered to the U.S. Air Force in June of 2011, and 10 more would be delivered that year. In 2012, they would begin testing, including ordnance testing and other things. But because of various issues that, again, not really going to go into in this video, delay after delay after delay. It wasn't until August of 2016 that the Air Force declared their first squadron had reached initial operational readiness. And then after a major software update in 2017, they declared the F-35A fully combat capable, fully available. The F-35A would see combat in the U.S. Air Force in April of 2019 when they were used to attack Islamic State elements in Iraq. But actually, the first Air Force to use this plane in combat was that of Israel, who has a version of the F-35A known as the F-35I, which essentially has Israeli avionics and a few other components. Well, they first used theirs in 2018, May 22, against Iranian-supported forces. And they continued to use their 35Is throughout the summer of this year, 2019. So they were kind of putting it through its paces early on. This particular model from Hobbymaster is from the Australian Royal Air Force. So Australia also has purchased the A. It's probably the most widespread version being adopted by U.S. allies. And again, it's the basic version designed for standard takeoff and landing. It has a capability of carrying a decent payload. But what about the other versions? Well, whereas the F-35A really wasn't a huge leap forward from prior jets, aside from just, modern avionics, electronics, and the ability to be stealthy, the 35B was a very ambitious plane for the 90s and even for today. its goal was to really improve upon the Harrier, which, if you know me, you know I like the Harrier. But it wasn't perfect. For one thing, it was firmly subsonic. Also, because it was made before modern computers and all that were available, its hovering and vertical systems were pretty tricky. You used 4 jets and it kind of balanced on them, and it had some issues with sucking in its own wash when trying to land, and could suck in the hot air, and could be pretty dangerous. It was still an effective aircraft, especially later versions like the Harrier II or AV-8B, but yeah. The 2 driving forces for the B were the Marine Corps and the British government. The British were retiring their Harriers, and they'd already long since retired their full-size carriers, so they needed a jump jet to operate for the Royal Navy, and the Royal Air Force was getting ready to retire a lot of its older planes like Tornadoes. So B Systems has been a major part of the F-35 project since the very beginning. In fact, they were involved in testing the 35B, the vertical lift version, when it was still the X-35. So very much a partner, not a customer. In fact, Britain provided a great deal of funding. The U.S. still has, paid the bulk on this plane. No argument there, but Britain has definitely put in some dimes itself. In fact, this model is a model of a British, as it's called there, Lightning. Anywho, after the 35A was advanced in testing, the 35B first made its maiden flight in 2008, and then at the beginning of 2010 they began testing its vertical takeoff or short takeoff and vertical landing system. This was really the big sticking point with it because the system is very unique. It uses the main engine with a gearbox, and it's associated with a major fan here behind the cockpit where it opens up to give pressure. It also has 2 smaller guides on the wings to control the roll, and when needed, the engine nozzle in the back rotates vectors down. So it's a very complex system, but the flip side is it is more controllable, thanks in large part to computers, than the Harrier, and it's also capable of going supersonic. This can still go Mach 1.6. That's a major step forward for a short takeoff or vertical takeoff and landing modern fighter. In addition to that, it is stealth capable. It has the same dimensions, about 50.5 feet long, 35 feet on the wingspan. It does have an internal weapons bay with 4 hardpoints as well. However, whereas the 35A can carry 2 2,000-pound bombs or guided munitions, the 35B can carry 2 1,000-pound. Also, because of the lift system, its fuel tanks have been cut by about 1/3, so it has 2/3 the fuel capacity, although it can use external ferry tanks. Also, it does not have an internal cannon. That was not involved, again, for, they needed the space for the system. So there were sacrifices, but it gave the Marines what they wanted and gave the British something they felt was superior to the Harrier. The Marines received their first 35Bs in November of 2012. And then the British would receive their first 3 35Bs the next year in 2013, and both have begun practicing, testing, and all that. At first, the Marines would not mess with the vertical takeoff and landing system. They would just operate it conventionally. But then, of course, they would start working with that, first with test pilots and then regular Marine aviators. They were entering into this phase in 2013. And interestingly, by July of 2015, the Marines were the first of the U.S. branches to declare their Lightnings initially combat capable. And then they would declare full readiness a year later. They would first be practicing with these, and then the Marines would be the first Americans to use the Lightning in combat in September of 2018, when they were used in Afghanistan to strike Taliban assets. And they've continued to be used since then. Likewise, in 2017, the British government confirmed that they would purchase at least 135 of these for both the Royal Air Force and Royal Navy. They're not sure if they want to buy any A's for the Air Force as well. On the one hand, they would suit the Air Force a little better. On the other hand, they like having the one type aircraft in the fleet. They too declared they were fully combat ready in January this year, 2019, and began using these in Iraq against Islamic State assets earlier this summer. So now British Lightnings are being utilized as well. And frankly, as complicated as this system is, in some ways it's simpler than what Boeing had proposed. And in a lot of ways it's simpler than the Harrier, at least when it comes to flight controls. Also, that lack of a cannon was never going to stand. Testing began on a pod to hang down below. Helps if I point it the right way, huh? This would mount under the fuselage. It holds 220 rounds of 25 millimeter, so a little bit more than the internal. And believe it or not, it's actually designed to be stealthy. So it can fly with the pod on board and still have a good stealth, a low radar return. And they developed special software that they implemented in 2018 for targeting and all of that with it. So it's a pretty advanced gun pod. And these are starting to see use on both U.S. Marine and RAF F-35Bs. In a lot of ways, this variant drove the whole F-35 project, but also was a cause of much delay and consternation. But it is an impressive feat to have a supersonic V-STOL or VTOL aircraft. No one can deny that. The fact that it's also stealth capable and can carry quite a wide range of ordnance is just kind of icing on the cake. The Marines, of course, will probably place further orders, but they've committed to buy at least 330 at this point. But again, that'll probably go up as time goes on. On the other hand, this has limited interest to American allies because most air forces don't need a vertical capable fighter, and most nations do not operate carriers. And speaking of carriers, the F-35C, the Naval or carrier-based version of the Lightning. The prototype or pre-production model first flew in the summer of 2010, so kind of have a 2-year interval thing, 2006, 2008, 2010. The first ones were delivered for the Navy to test out kind of simulated carrier takeoff and landings, based on land and whatnot, and there was an early problem. The tailhook system was far from sufficient. So this required a pretty radical redesign to make sure this would not overshoot the deck. So it wasn't until 2013 that a new Cato bar system, as they call it, was developed by Lockheed Martin. And therefore, it wasn't until November, so nearly the end of 2014, that an F-35C made its first carrier landing. And testing would continue for quite some time, including night operations and ordnance and all that. And it wasn't until February of this year, 2019, that the Navy declared its first squadron of F-35Cs had reached initial operational status. So, very much the last of the three. These were only reaching operational status while the other two variants had already seen combat. What do we have here? In a lot of ways it is similar to the A, but beefier. It's a little bit longer. It's still 50 feet, but it's getting close to 51 feet. Most of that has to do with the landing situation. But the big difference is the wing. The wing is 43 feet wide, so 8 foot more than the regular. It also can fold, or at least the tips can fold up for use on board a carrier. Because of this larger wing, it has a larger internal fuel capacity. Can hold about 20 to 30% more fuel, giving it more endurance or a longer range than the other versions. So making it quite possibly the most capable version in some sense. It also has a reinforced undercarriage for carrier deck operations. And instead of having a single wheel in the front for the nose, it has a dual wheel arrangement. And like I said, it has a Cato bar in the back for arrest landings on carriers. Like the 35B, it does not have an internal cannon, but the pod I showed you here can work on the 35C if a gun is needed. But for their uses, the Navy's never really been big on the cannon, not like the Air Force. The Air Force, like I said, primarily wanted to use theirs for ground attack or close air support. The Marines, of course, close air support's important, and us, just being kind of near the battlefield, rapid response. The Navy, on the other hand, they're thinking more as a interceptor, air superiority, or fleet defense fighter. So that's why the endurance, all that, is more important. It still has the 10 hard points, 6 on the wings and the 4 internals. So that really hasn't changed. The primary user, of course, will be the U.S. Navy, who has committed to at least 260. The idea is to replace the legacy FA-18 Hornet. At this time, the plan is to operate these alongside the FA-18 Super Hornet, though. Remember, as I said in the Hornet video, the Navy has gone to an all-Hornet fleet after retiring the Tomcat. So this will operate alongside them. Interestingly, the U.S. Marines have also committed to purchase 80 F-35Cs, and these will be used on board Navy ships, Navy carriers, as part of the Marines' support of the Navy. And they might buy more themselves. And that seems to be it. Again, kind of like the B, this has a pretty limited interest from foreign customers, although I'm sure it's available. Most are going to go for the A. And again, this too is, of course, stealth capable. And I have this model loaded out with a couple of missiles and JDAM type bombs, just because, why not? And of course you can, say it has internal ordnance if you wish. So that's kind of a rundown of the F-35 as of 2019. It is finally going into service. As I said at the beginning, the U.S. is planning to purchase over 2,600 to date. Over 435 have been built. Parts are being made for these all over the world, especially Britain. One thing to point, Turkey was originally involved in the Lightning project, but was booted out this past summer, July of 2019, so their commitment will be taken over by other people. So production is spread out, giving large contracts to many companies in many countries around the world. Early on, there were myriad issues. This is an infinitely complicated machine, and they're trying to do a lot with one basic airframe. And of course, as I said, the cost overruns. The cost of this program has been almost incalculable. So much money. The U.S. plans to keep taking deliveries of new F-35s until at least 2037. And the projection is to have these in service until at least 2070. So, a 50-plus year life cycle. As I said initially, this was designed to be easily upgradable. And Lockheed claims as full production continues to ramp up and speed up, and as the cost of R&D is absorbed, the cost for individual production aircraft will go down, as will the cost per flight hour. In fact, they claim this has already started to happen. I know 50-plus years seems ludicrous, but consider how old the B-52 is, how long the F-4 Phantom flew, how long some of the MiGs have been in service. So it's not totally without precedent. But of course, there might be a large component of wishful thinking there as well. Only time will tell the future. This project really is the definition of too big to fail. Too many nations, too many companies, too many politicians, too many generals has staked too much on this, so it was kind of just had to happen. Plus, many countries like Britain were banking on it. I mean, if the lightning did not happen, what would? Australia, like some others, ended up going with some Hornets to fill the gap. But at least unlike the the F-22, this is technology that will be dispersed and sold. Again, there's been a lot of criticism. It's amazing the money militaries will spend, but only time will tell how this works out. It seems to be shaping up to be a good fighter, but the question is it money well spent? The idea of a multi-role fighter that can serve all of our branches, not to mention all the branches of Britain and other allies, sounds great. And there's really not a whole lot of other things on the horizon as an alternative, but a lot depends on the future, not just here, but also what Russia and China come up with. How their technology progresses. Alrighty guys, well, I gotta get to other things, but I wanted to complete this stealth series. As for the Hobbymaster models, typical. These do have a little more plastic on them than some, especially the 35B because of how it transforms. So they do feel a little light. At least this one does. The top's all metal. The C is definitely the heaviest of the three. But it's your typical Hobbymaster quality. Gear up or down, ordnance on or off, cockpit open and closed. In the case of the 35B, you can have it in any stage of its flight mode as you wish. Air Force One also offers a 35, as do a few other companies. But I would say probably Hobbymaster is the best, at least in this price range. Anyway, folks, I appreciate you tuning in for this series. I hope you enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun making it. Did this while on vacation. Probably be the last video I do on this here vacation, so so I choose to spend my time making videos for you all. If you could, like, share, and subscribe, and I will catch you very soon next time.